The attack came in the dead of night. There was no warning, no alarm, no time to prepare. One moment the station was wrapped in the quiet hum of recycled air and sleeping bodies, and the next, the world shook apart. The first explosion hit the communication array on the roof of the station. It tore through metal and wire like paper, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the thin atmosphere of Calyx 7. The second strike hit the landing pads on the eastern side, turning the two parked transport shuttles into fireballs that lit up the dark surface of the moon in a sickening orange glow. Kyle Brogan was on his feet before the shaking stopped. Years of training and instinct pulled him out of sleep and into motion before his mind even caught up with what was happening. He grabbed his rifle from beside his bunk, pulled on his boots, and was running through the corridor within seconds. The lights flickered and went red as the station switched to emergency power. He reached the armory and found Danny Hale already there, half-dressed and loading magazines with hands that moved fast but steady. Hale looked at him and for once did not smile. He just nodded and tossed Brogan a chest plate. The rest of the squad arrived in ones and twos over the next minute, pulling on armor and grabbing weapons with the hurried focus of people who understood, even through their fear, that every second counted. Brogan gave his orders quickly. He sent 2 soldiers to start moving civilians into the underground mining tunnels, where the rock would give them cover. He positioned the rest at the main corridor that connected the habitation block to the outer structures. If anything was coming in, it would come through there. Lieutenant Greer reached the command center at the same time the ground assault began. She stood at the main console, hands shaking, watching the external cameras as dozens of dark shapes slammed into the surface of the moon outside. Drop pods. Alien drop pods. They hit the dust like iron fists, cracking open to release tall, armored figures that poured out in organized waves. They moved fast, faster than any human, their segmented legs carrying them across the ground in a way that looked both fluid and wrong at the same time. Their exoskeletons were dark, almost black, and their glowing eyes swept across the terrain with cold purpose. The Vraxith had arrived. Greer felt her stomach drop. She had read about the Vraxith in briefing documents. She knew the name. She knew they were dangerous. But reading about them and watching 300 of them sprint toward her station were two very different things. She forced herself to breathe. She forced her hands to stop shaking. Then she opened a channel to Brogan. She told him the numbers. She heard silence on the other end for 2 seconds, and then Brogan's voice came back, calm and flat. He said he understood. He told her to try to get a distress signal out, any way she could. Then the channel went dead, and the first Vraxith hit the outer doors. The fighting started in the main corridor. The Vraxith blew through the outer airlock with a breaching charge that buckled the reinforced steel inward. They came through the smoke in a rush, their clawed limbs scraping against the metal floor, their mandibles open and screeching. Brogan's squad opened fire. The sound was deafening in the narrow corridor. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness in rapid bursts. The first wave of Vraxith stumbled and fell as bullets struck their exoskeletons, cracking through the natural armor at close range. But more came behind them, climbing over the bodies of the fallen, pressing forward with a relentless swarming pressure that felt less like a military advance and more like a tide. Danny Hale had positioned himself on a catwalk above the corridor. From his elevated angle, he could see the Vraxith officers, the ones with the slightly different coloring and the larger mandibles, standing behind the front line and directing the attack. He put his scope on the first one and fired. The round punched through the officer's head, and the alien dropped without a sound. Hale shifted to the next one, and the next. Each shot was clean and precise, and each kill sent a ripple of confusion through the Vraxith formation below. They were not used to losing their commanders this fast. On the ground level, Laura Keene held the left side of the corridor, with 2 other soldiers. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but her hands were steady on her rifle. She had never fired at a living target before tonight. The first time she pulled the trigger and watched a Vraxith warrior collapse at her feet, something shifted inside her. Not joy, not horror, just a cold, clear focus that pushed everything else away. She kept firing, but the numbers were too great. For every Vraxith that fell, 2 more took its place. They were fast, and they learned quickly. After losing several officers to Hale's sniper fire, they began using the bodies of their fallen as shields, pushing forward behind walls of dead. A second group breached a side entrance that the squad had not been able to barricade in time. Brogan heard the screech of alien voices coming from behind them and knew the position was lost. He gave the order to fall back. The retreat into the mining tunnels was controlled but desperate. Brogan and Hale held the rear, firing short bursts to keep the Vraxith at a distance, while the rest of the squad and the civilians moved deeper underground. Laura Keene helped carry a wounded soldier over her shoulder, her legs burning with the effort, refusing to slow down. When the last person was through the tunnel entrance, Brogan pulled the detonator from his vest and triggered the demolition charges they had placed on the ceiling months ago during a routine safety drill. The explosion brought down tons of rock and metal, sealing the tunnel entrance in a cloud of dust and noise. The sound of Vraxith claws on the other side faded into muffled scraping. In the darkness of the tunnels, lit only by the pale glow of emergency lights, the survivors gathered. Brogan did a head count. 10 soldiers still able to fight, 2 dead left behind in the corridor. Several wounded, including 1 civilian who had taken shrapnel during the initial bombardment. 40 civilians were alive and packed into the deeper mining shafts, frightened but unharmed. Greer found Brogan in the dim light. Her uniform was covered in dust, and there was a cut on her forehead, but her eyes were steady now. She told him that before they retreated, she had managed to reroute power from the geology lab to a backup transmitter hidden in the station's lower levels. She had sent a distress signal. It was short, broken, and weak, but it had gone out into open space on a wide frequency. Brogan asked her if anyone had received it. She said she did not know. He nodded slowly and turned to face his squad. They were standing in a loose half-circle around him, battered and tired, their faces smeared with dust and sweat. Some of them were young, too young for this. He looked at each of them and spoke in a voice that was low but carried through the silence of the tunnel. He told them the truth. He said they were outnumbered, cut off, and running low on everything that mattered. He said help might come, or it might not. The Vraxith were on the other side of that collapsed rock, and they would find a way through eventually. And when they did, this tunnel was where the line would be drawn. He told them they were going to hold that line. Danny Hale, leaning against the tunnel wall with his rifle across his chest, let out a slow breath and said that at least they would not have to worry about being bored anymore. A few soldiers laughed, short and sharp, the kind of laughter that comes not from humor, but from the need to feel something other than fear. Laura Keene did not laugh. She sat on a rock near the back of the group, checking her rifle with careful hands. She counted her remaining magazines. She placed them neatly beside her and looked up at the sealed tunnel entrance. From somewhere beyond the rock, deep and faint, came the sound of Vraxith claws scraping against stone. They were already trying to dig through. Keene picked up her rifle, set it across her knees, and waited. 2 systems away, the UES Anvil was cutting through the emptiness of deep space on a routine patrol that had been quiet for weeks. The Anvil was a fast attack destroyer, lean and angular, built not for comfort, but for speed and violence. Its hull was painted dark gray, scarred from past engagements, and it carried enough firepower to ruin the day of anything short of a capital warship. Commander Nathan Cole, sat in the captain's chair on the bridge, reading a maintenance report on his datapad when the communications officer called out. A signal had come in. It was weak, broken, and full of static, but the automated systems had flagged it as a priority distress call on a United Earth Defense Corps frequency. The officer cleaned it up as much as she could and played it through the bridge speakers. The message was fragmented. Most of the words were lost to interference. But three things came through clearly. The designation Outpost Redcliffe, the word attack, and coordinates for the Calyx 7 system. Cole set down his datapad. He was a man of 45 with gray at his temples, and lines around his eyes that came not from age, but from years of making decisions that carried the weight of other people's lives. He had served in the Defense Corps for over 20 years. He had fought in 3 major engagements, lost friends in 2 of them, and earned a reputation as the kind of officer who never hesitated and never left people behind. He did not hesitate now. He ordered the helmsman to change course for Calyx 7 at maximum speed. He sent a priority alert to Earth Command, reporting the distress signal and his intention to respond. Then he stood up from his chair and told his executive officer to wake up Vanguard. Fireteam Vanguard was the Anvil's onboard rapid response unit. 16 of the finest Special Forces operators in the United Earth Defense Corps. They were not regular soldiers. They were the ones who got sent when regular soldiers were not enough. Every member had been selected through a brutal qualification process that washed out 90% of applicants. And every one of them had seen combat that would break most people. Their leader was Master Sergeant Ethan Grant. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders and thick through the arms, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, and then hit a few times for good measure. A long scar ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw, a souvenir from a Vraxith blade on a colony world called Harkin's Reach 3 years earlier. On that day, Grant had lost his entire squad, 8 men and women, gone in a single ambush. He had fought his way out alone, carrying the body of his closest friend for 6 kilometers through enemy territory before a rescue team found him. The Vraxith had taken everything from him on Harkin's Reach. He had spent every day since then making sure they would never take anything from anyone again. His second-in-command was Sergeant Megan Cross. She was smaller than most of the team, wiry and fast, with short dark hair and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Cross was a specialist in close-quarters combat and demolitions. She could clear a room faster than anyone Grant had ever seen, and she could build a shaped charge out of almost anything. She spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened. The rest of the team gathered in the Anvil's drop bay as the ship burned toward Calyx 7. Corporal Rick Harmon, the heavy weapons specialist, was a big, easygoing man who carried a plasma cannon the way most people carried a sidearm. He sat on a bench, calibrating the weapon's targeting system, while old country music played softly from a speaker he had taped to his locker. He hummed along, completely at ease, as if he were preparing for a camping trip instead of a combat drop. Private First Class Tina Alcott was the youngest member of Vanguard. She was 23, thin-faced and intense, with a habit of studying everything with an almost obsessive focus. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the drop bay with her datapad open, scrolling through Vraxith anatomy charts she had downloaded months ago. She knew where their exoskeletons were thinnest, where their nerve clusters sat, where a single well-placed round could drop one of them instantly. She had never fought the Vraxith in person, and the thought of it made her stomach tight, but she buried the fear beneath preparation. If she knew enough, she told herself, she would be ready. Staff Sergeant Joe Dalton sat apart from the others, quiet as always. He was the team's breacher, the one who went through doors first. He had a combat knife on his belt that he had carried through 6 deployments, and he sharpened it slowly with a small stone, the soft scraping sound blending with the hum of the ship's engines. Dalton never talked about his past missions. He just showed up, did his job, and came back. That simplicity was what made him one of the most reliable operators Grant had ever worked with. Grant stood in the center of the drop bay and briefed his team. He told them what they knew, which was not much: an isolated outpost, a distress signal, possible alien attack. He told them what the sensors on the anvil were starting to show as they got closer to Calyx 7, which was worse. 3 Vraxith cruisers in orbit around the moon. Heavy damage to the outpost's surface structures. No communication from the station. The room was silent. Grant looked at each of his operators in turn. He told them that there were people down there. Soldiers, civilians, people who had been forgotten at the edge of space and were now fighting for their lives. He said Vanguard was going to go down there and bring them home. No one argued. No one asked questions. They just checked their weapons and started putting on their drop suits. Meanwhile, Commander Cole was working the problem from the bridge. The anvil was fast, but it was 1 ship against 3 Vraxith cruisers. In a straight fight, the math was not in their favor. Cole studied the tactical display and saw an opportunity. Calyx 7 sat within a dense debris field, a ring of shattered rock and old asteroid fragments that orbited the gas giant. If the anvil came in fast through the debris field, using the rocks as cover, it could get close enough to the moon to deploy Vanguard before the Vraxith cruisers could respond in force. The debris field was thick, and one wrong move at high speed would turn the anvil into scrap. But Cole had flown through worse, and his helmsman was one of the best in the fleet. He gave the order. Back in the tunnels of Redcliffe, the situation was growing more desperate by the hour. The Vraxith had brought drilling equipment to the collapsed entrance and were grinding through the rock with slow, steady progress. Brogan could hear the vibration through the walls, a constant low hum that set everyone's teeth on edge. He organized his defenses as best he could. Nora Whitfield proved invaluable. She knew the tunnel network better than anyone, and identified 3 choke points where the defenders could make a stand if the Vraxith broke through. Brogan set traps at each one, using mining explosives and tripwires made from equipment wire. It was rough work, but it would slow the enemy down. They carried supplies, tended the wounded, and reinforced barricades with whatever they could find. Fear was everywhere, in every face, in every voice, but so was something else, a stubborn refusal to give in. These were miners and researchers, not warriors, but they worked alongside the soldiers without complaint. The moment came without ceremony. The anvil burst out of the debris field at full speed, its engines blazing white against the black sky. The Vraxith cruisers scrambled to respond, their weapons swinging toward the incoming ship. Cole held his course, steady and straight, aimed directly at the moon. At the last possible moment, the anvil's belly opened, and 16 orbital drop pods launched in a tight spread, streaking toward the surface of Calyx 7 like falling stars. Inside his pod, Ethan Grant gripped his rifle and felt the familiar violence of atmospheric entry shake through his bones. Through the tiny viewport, he could see the gray surface of the moon rushing up to meet him. Somewhere down there, people were counting on him. The pods hit the ground hard, punching craters into the dust. Hatches blew open. 16 armored figures rose from the smoke and dust, weapons up, eyes forward. Vanguard had arrived. Ethan Grant was moving before the dust from his drop pod had settled. He pulled himself out of the cratered earth, swept his rifle across the barren landscape, and activated his squad's communication channel. One by one, green status lights blinked on inside his helmet display. All 16 operators were on the ground. All 16 were combat ready. They had landed roughly half a kilometer south of Outpost Redcliffe. From their position, Grant could see the damaged station in the distance, its communication tower sheared off and its outer structures scarred by weapons fire. Smoke drifted lazily from the destroyed landing pads. Between his team and the station, the gray surface of the moon was covered with Vraxith forces. Alien warriors moved in organized patrols around the outpost perimeter, their dark exoskeletons blending with the dusty ground, their compound eyes scanning in every direction. Drop pods and makeshift field camps dotted the terrain. Grant studied the scene for less than 10 seconds, then he gave his orders. Megan Cross took 4 operators and swung wide to the left, using a shallow ridge as cover to approach the Vraxith from the western flank. Rick Harmon set up his plasma cannon on a low rise to the south, where he had a clear line of sight across the open ground between the alien positions. Tina Alcott and Joe Dalton stayed with Grant in the center element, along with the remaining operators. The plan was simple. Harmon would open the fight from range. Cross would hit them from the side. Grant would drive straight through the middle. There was no countdown, no dramatic pause. Harmon settled behind his plasma cannon, put his eye to the targeting scope, and fired. The first shot turned a Vraxith patrol group into a cloud of shattered exoskeleton and dust. The sound of the plasma cannon rolled across the flat terrain like thunder, and for a single frozen moment, every alien on the surface turned toward the flash. That moment was all Vanguard needed. Grant and his center team broke from cover at a full sprint. Their combat suits amplified their speed and strength, and they crossed the open ground in seconds. The Vraxith reacted fast, spinning toward the charging humans with weapons raised. But Grant was faster. He put 2 rounds through the first warrior's head before it could fire, sidestepped its falling body, and dropped the one behind it with a short burst to the chest. Dalton was beside him, moving with that quiet mechanical precision that made him so deadly. He cleared his side of the approach without wasting a single bullet, each shot placed exactly where it needed to go. Tina Alcott felt the fear rise in her throat as she ran toward the alien line, but she pushed it down and let her training take over. She had memorized the Vraxith anatomy charts so many times that targeting their weak points was almost automatic. She aimed for the joints where the exoskeleton was thinnest, for the gap beneath the mandible where the nerve cluster sat, for the soft tissue behind the forward leg plate. Every round she fired found its mark. On the western flank, Megan Cross hit the Vraxith like a blade through cloth. Her team came over the ridge in a fast, silent rush, catching an entire alien fire team from behind. Cross moved through them with a speed that was almost impossible to follow. She fired in short, controlled bursts, dropped an empty magazine, loaded a new one, and kept moving without breaking stride. A Vraxith heavy weapon emplacement sat on a small mound ahead of her, its crew swinging the cannon toward Grant's advancing team. Cross pulled a shape charge from her vest, armed it in one smooth motion, and threw it. The explosion split the emplacement apart and silenced the cannon before it could fire a single shot. Rick Harmon kept the pressure on from his position on the ridge. His plasma cannon roared again and again, each shot tearing through the Vraxith formations like a fist through glass. The aliens tried to advance on his position twice. Both times they were cut down before they got within 100 meters. Harmon hummed softly to himself between shots, the same country song he had been listening to in the drop bay, his hand steady and his aim true. The Vraxith were in chaos. They had spent hours fighting the Outpost's small security team and had grown confident. They expected more of the same. What they got instead was something that shattered every assumption they had made about humans. These were not frightened miners hiding behind barricades. These were predators, armored and fast, hitting from multiple directions, with a coordination that the Vraxith's own hive mind could barely match. Reports flooded back to Felvron aboard his command cruiser in orbit. His officers relayed the situation with voices that trembled in a way he had never heard before. They told him that new humans had arrived, only a small number, but they were cutting through the ground forces with terrifying efficiency. Entire squads were being eliminated in seconds. The perimeter was collapsing. Felvron demanded to see the battle footage. When the images reached his screen, he watched in silence as a single human operator, Grant, charged into a cluster of 6 Vraxith warriors and brought down all 6 in less than 4 seconds. He watched Cross move through his soldiers like a ghost, striking and vanishing, and striking again. He watched Harmon's plasma cannon erase a column of 30 warriors in 2 shots. For the first time in his long career, Felvron felt something he had not felt in decades: doubt. On the surface, Grant and his team reached the sealed tunnel entrance. He switched to the Outpost's emergency frequency and called out, identifying himself and Vanguard. There was a long pause, and then a voice came back, rough and tired and cautious. It was Brogan. Grant told him to open the tunnel. Brogan asked him how he knew they were alive. Grant said he did not, but he came anyway. The rock shifted and scraped as the defenders inside cleared enough of the collapse to create an opening. Brogan came through first, his face covered in dust, his left arm wrapped in a bloody bandage, his eyes hollow from hours of fighting and waiting. He looked at Grant, at the armored operators standing behind him, and for a moment he did not speak. Then he reached out his hand. Grant took it and held it firmly. He told Brogan that no one gets left behind. What followed was a counterattack that the Vraxith had no answer for. Brogan's defenders emerged from the tunnels, armed with fresh weapons and ammunition that Vanguard had brought down in their drop pods. The exhausted security team, given new tools and new hope, fought with a fury that surprised even Grant. They knew this ground. They knew these tunnels and corridors, and now they had the firepower to take them back. Danny Hale paired up with Tina Alcott. The 2 snipers took a position on the roof of the station's damaged habitation block, where they had a wide view of the surrounding terrain. Working together, they began systematically picking off Vraxith officers and squad leaders. Every kill disrupted the alien command structure further, turning organized units into confused groups that stumbled into kill zones set up by the rest of the team. Laura Keene found herself beside Megan Cross as they moved through a narrow surface canyon that led behind the Vraxith rear lines. Keene was tired, her muscles ached, and her hands were raw from hours of gripping her weapon in the tunnels. But she kept pace with Cross, step for step. When they hit the Vraxith supply camp from behind, Keene moved with a confidence that would have been unrecognizable to the quiet, nervous private who had arrived on Calyx 7 weeks ago. Cross glanced at her once during the fight and gave a short nod of approval. It was the highest compliment she ever gave. Above them, the battle for orbital control raged on. Commander Cole and the Anvil had been dodging Vraxith cruiser fire through the debris field for the better part of an hour. A section of the port hull was venting atmosphere, and 2 crew members were in the medical bay with burns. But Cole held the ship together with sheer willpower and the skill of a crew that trusted him completely. When he saw an opening, a brief moment where one Vraxith cruiser drifted too far from the other 2, he took it. A full spread of torpedoes streaked across the void and struck the cruiser amidships. The alien vessel broke in half, its 2 pieces spiraling away in opposite directions, trailing fire and debris. On the ground, the Vraxith broke. Their retreat began slowly, individual warriors pulling back from positions they could no longer hold, and then all at once, as the entire remaining force turned and ran for their drop pods. The humans pursued them to the edge of the outpost perimeter and stopped. Grant ordered his team to hold. The fight was over. From his command cruiser, Felvron watched his warriors flee across the surface of the moon. 300 had gone down. Less than half were coming back. He stared at the tactical display and saw a truth he could not ignore. He opened a channel to the Vraxith Dominion High Command and recorded a single message. He told them that the humans were not what they had expected. He told them that even at their weakest, in their most forgotten places, they were dangerous beyond measure. He told them to stay away from human space. Then he ordered his 2 remaining cruisers to withdraw. The silence that followed the battle was almost harder to bear than the noise. For hours, the world had been filled with gunfire, explosions, the screech of alien voices, and the steady pounding of a heart pushed to its limit. And then, all at once, it stopped. The Vraxith drop pods lifted off the surface in a ragged, disordered rush, climbing into the sky and vanishing into the bellies of the 2 remaining cruisers that hung in orbit above Calyx 7. The cruisers turned slowly, their engines flaring blue-white, and pulled away from the moon. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the vast darkness between the stars. On the surface, no one moved for a long time. Ethan Grant stood at the edge of the outpost, near the shattered remains of what had once been the main airlock. His rifle hung at his side, still warm. His combat suit was scorched and dented in half a dozen places, and there was alien blood drying in dark streaks across his chestplate. He stared out at the battlefield, at the craters and the wreckage, and the still, dark shapes of fallen Vraxith warriors scattered across the dust. The thin atmosphere of Calyx 7 carried no wind, so nothing moved. It was like looking at a photograph of something terrible. Megan Cross walked up beside him. Her face was calm, the way it always was after a fight, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that she did not try to hide. She stood next to Grant and looked out at the same view. Neither of them spoke for a while. The kind of silence that does not need to be filled because both people understand what is sitting inside it. Grant finally spoke. He said this was not just about saving 40 people on a forgotten moon. It was about something bigger. It was about what happens when the galaxy decides to test humanity, to reach out and strike at the smallest, most isolated piece of the human family, and see what happens. He said what happened here would be remembered, not just by the people who survived it, but by every species out there that was watching and wondering how far they could push before something pushed back. Cross looked at him and nodded. She understood. She had always understood. That was why she had joined Vanguard in the first place. Not for glory, not for medals, but because somewhere deep inside her, she believed that the only thing standing between the darkness and the people who could not fight it was someone willing to step forward. Inside the mining tunnels, the civilians began to emerge. They came out slowly, blinking in the harsh artificial light of the emergency lamps that still flickered along the outpost's surviving corridors. Their faces were pale and drawn, marked by hours of fear and uncertainty. Some of them were crying. Others just stood still and looked around, as if they could not quite believe that they were still alive. Dr. Nora Whitfield was among the last to come out. She walked through the wreckage of her research lab, stepping over broken equipment and scattered data pads. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and dust covered everything in a fine gray layer. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked around at the destruction. Then, slowly, a small smile crossed her face. She turned to Brogan, who had followed her in, and told him that the deep scans were still intact on the backup servers. The Valith ore deposits were untouched. The Vraxith had not gotten what they came for. Brogan leaned against a cracked wall, his bandaged arm held close to his body. He was exhausted beyond anything he had ever felt, the kind of tired that lived in the bones and would not leave for days. He looked at Nora and allowed himself a brief, dry smile. He told her they never do. Then he pushed himself off the wall and walked back out to check on his soldiers. Lieutenant Greer was in the command center, or what was left of it. Half the consoles were dead, and the main display was cracked down the middle. But she sat at the one working terminal, methodically running through damage reports and system checks, doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was keep things organized, even when the world was falling apart around her. Brogan found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. She looked up and met his eyes. The fear that had been in her face during the first moments of the attack was gone now, replaced by something quieter and steadier. She told him, in a voice that was almost too calm, that she had been terrified from the very first explosion. She said she had never trained for any of this. She said she did not know how he and his soldiers had done what they did. Brogan shook his head. He told her that none of them had trained for this either. Not really. He said the difference between falling apart and holding together was not training or bravery or anything that could be taught in a classroom. It was just the decision to keep going when every part of you wanted to stop. He said she had made that decision the moment she stayed at her console and sent that distress signal instead of running. And that was enough. Greer looked at him for a long moment, and then she simply said, "Thank you." Not in a grand or dramatic way, just two quiet words between two people who had survived something that should have killed them both. Outside, Danny Hale and Laura Keene sat together on a supply crate near the tunnel entrance. The moon's weak sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the pockmarked surface. Hale had his rifle across his lap and his back against the wall. For the first time since Keene had known him, he had nothing funny to say. His face was still, his eyes distant, looking at something only he could see. Keene spoke first. She said she had never imagined that her first deployment would be anything like this. She had expected boring shifts and routine patrols, and maybe, if she was lucky, a transfer to somewhere more interesting after a year. She did not expect to fight for her life in a tunnel against alien invaders. Hale turned his head and looked at her. His expression softened just a little. He told her that she had fought like someone who had been doing it for years. He said there were veterans with 10 times her experience who would have frozen in that corridor, and she had not. He said he was proud to have stood beside her. It was the most sincere thing Keene had ever heard him say. She did not reply with words. She just gave a small, tired nod, and looked back out at the rising sun. Rick Harmon worked alongside the Anvil's engineering team to patch the Outpost's communication array. He was surprisingly good with tools for a man whose primary skill was destroying things. And within a few hours, the array was functional enough to send and receive basic transmissions. When the connection to Earth Command was restored, the response was immediate. Reinforcements were already on the way. 3 destroyers and a heavy cruiser had been dispatched the moment Cole's alert reached Fleet Command. They would arrive within 20 hours. But more than that, word had gotten out. The story of Redcliffe, of 12 soldiers and 40 civilians holding against 300 Vraxith warriors, of a single destroyer and 16 Special Forces operators breaking through to save them, had spread through the fleet's communication channels like fire through dry grass. Outposts and ships across human space were talking about it. Morale in the Defense Corps, which had been low after months of quiet tension and scattered border incidents, surged overnight. Commander Cole brought the Anvil into a stable orbit above Calyx 7, and finally allowed himself to sit back in his chair. His ship was battered, 2 hull breaches, a damaged engine pod, and a weapons array that would need weeks of repair. But his crew was alive, and the people on the ground were safe. That was enough. The final scene of the story moved far from Calyx 7, to the darkened command chamber of a Vraxith cruiser, limping through deep space on its way back to Dominion territory. Thelvron sat alone, his scarred exoskeleton catching the dim light from the holographic display in front of him. He was replaying the battle data for the 3rd time. He watched the footage of Vanguard's drop, of their assault across the open ground, of the way they moved and fought with a speed and violence that his warriors could not match. His advisors stood behind him, waiting. One of them finally spoke. He suggested that the Dominion should send a larger fleet. 10 cruisers, perhaps 20, enough to overwhelm any human response. He argued that the Valeth ore was too valuable to abandon. Thelvron was silent for a long time. Then he turned off the display and faced his advisors. He told them to consider what they had seen. They had sent 300 warriors to attack what they believed was the weakest, most forgotten corner of human territory. A place so small and remote that no one should have noticed or cared. And this is what had answered. 16 soldiers from a single ship had torn through their forces in less than an hour. He asked them to imagine what waited in the heart of human space. He asked them to picture what would come if they struck at something the humans actually cared about protecting. The advisors had no answer. The chamber was silent, except for the low hum of the ship's damaged engines. Thelvron ordered the fleet to set a course for home. He ordered a standing directive to avoid human space. The Vraxith would not return to Calyx 7. They would not test humanity again. Back on the moon, the survivors of Redcliffe gathered outside the outpost as the sun climbed higher over the horizon. Soldiers and civilians stood together, some leaning on each other, some standing alone, all of them looking up at the pale light spreading across the cratered landscape. They were bruised and bloodied and exhausted. They had lost friends. They had faced something that should have overwhelmed them completely. But they were still standing. Across the galaxy, in empires built on conquest and fear, in halls of power where ancient species had ruled for thousands of years, a quiet truth was beginning to take root. A truth carried by the fragmented battle reports of a defeated Vraxith force, and whispered between commanders who had never known uncertainty before. Humanity does not abandon its own. Even in the darkest, most forgotten corner of space, if you reach out and strike at them, something answers, and it does not come to talk. The moon called Calyx 7 was the kind of place the universe forgot about. It sat at the very edge of human-explored space, a small, gray rock, circling a gas giant that had no name anyone cared to remember. There was no beauty there, no green forests, no blue oceans, no soft wind, just dust, craters, and silence that stretched in every direction for as far as the eye could see. And sitting in the middle of all that emptiness, like a metal box dropped from the sky, was Outpost Redcliffe. Redcliffe was a mining and research station. 40 civilian workers lived and worked inside it. They drilled into the moon's crust, pulled out minerals, ran tests, filed reports, and waited for supply ships that came once every few months. It was boring work, and everyone there knew it. The kind of posting you accepted when you had nothing better to do or nowhere else to go. The station also had a small military presence. 12 soldiers from the United Earth Defense Corps were assigned to guard the outpost, though most of them wondered what exactly they were guarding it from. There had never been a threat. Not once. The nearest known alien territory was dozens of light years away, and no one in their right mind would bother attacking a place like Calyx 7. There was nothing here worth fighting over, or so everyone believed. Sergeant Kyle Brogan was the man in charge of those 12 soldiers. He was in his mid-30s, built solid, with a square jaw and tired eyes that always seemed to be looking at something no one else could see. Brogan had served in the Defense Corps for 14 years. He had seen a few skirmishes on colony worlds early in his career, enough to know what real danger felt like, and enough to know that his current team was not ready for it. He ran drills every morning, kept his soldiers sharp, and hoped that the worst they would ever face was boredom. Among his squad, 2 stood out. Corporal Danny Hale was a sharpshooter from Texas who had a joke for every occasion and a grin that never seemed to fade. He was good with a rifle, better than anyone else on the base, and he knew it. He walked with the lazy confidence of a man who believed he could shoot his way out of any problem. Private Laura Keene was the opposite. She was quiet, focused, and fresh out of training. Calyx 7 was her first real posting, and she treated every drill like her life depended on it. Brogan liked that about her. She reminded him of himself when he was young. The station's commanding officer was Lieutenant Amy Greer. She was smart, organized, and good with logistics, but she had never been in combat. Her career had been spent behind desks and inside command rooms, managing supply chains and writing reports. She ran Redcliffe with calm efficiency, and the civilians respected her for it. But Brogan sometimes caught a look in her eyes when he ran combat drills outside her office window. A look that said she hoped she would never have to use what he was teaching. It was Dr. Nora Whitfield who changed everything, though she did not know it at the time. Nora was the station's chief geologist, a tall woman with sharp features and a habit of talking to herself while she worked. She had been running deep scans of the moon's crust for weeks, and one evening she walked into Greer's office with a datapad and a strange expression on her face. She told Greer that there was something buried deep beneath the station, a mineral deposit unlike anything she had seen before. The readings were unusual, dense energy signatures that did not match any known element in their database. She could not say what it was, but she said it was big, and very powerful. Greer listened carefully, looked at the data, and told Nora she would send the report to Earth Command. She did, and then she moved on with her day. Earth Command was slow. They would probably send a follow-up team in 6 months, maybe a year. There was no rush. What no one on Redcliffe knew was that they were not the only ones who had noticed those energy signatures. Far away, in a region of space that human ships had never reached, the Vraxith Dominion had been watching. The Vraxith were an old and powerful empire. Their bodies were insectoid, tall and segmented, with hard exoskeletons the color of dark iron and compound eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They moved in swarms, fought in swarms, and thought in patterns that human minds could barely understand. They had been expanding their territory for centuries, consuming world after world, and they had recently turned their attention toward the edges of human space. Their scouts had picked up the energy readings from Calyx 7 weeks ago. The minerals buried beneath the moon's surface were called Valith ore in the Vraxith language, and it was the single most important resource their war machine needed. It powered their ships, their weapons, and their communication networks. Finding a deposit this large, this unguarded, was something their war commanders had dreamed of. Thelvron was the war commander assigned to the operation. He was old by Vraxith standards, his exoskeleton scarred from dozens of campaigns, his mandibles clicking with the slow rhythm of a being who had long stopped feeling fear. He studied the reports from Calyx 7 and saw nothing that concerned him. A handful of human soldiers, a few dozen soft-skinned miners, no warships in the system. It was not even a challenge. He dispatched 3 cruisers and 300 of his warriors. It would be a quick operation. They would land, kill or capture the humans, secure the ore, and leave before Earth even knew what had happened. Thelvron did not bother to request additional forces. He considered it an insult to waste more resources on such a weak target. Back on Redcliffe, the days passed quietly. Brogan ran his drills. Hale cracked his jokes. Keene studied her combat manuals in her bunk at night. Nora continued her scans. Greer filed her reports. The supply ship was due in 3 weeks, and the biggest concern on the station was whether the food synthesizer would hold out until then. It was a Tuesday night, station time, when the first sign appeared. Brogan was doing a late check of the sensor console when a small blip appeared at the edge of the system. It was faint, barely a flicker on the screen, and it disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. He stared at it for a long time. He ran a diagnostic on the sensors. Everything came back clean. He reported it to Greer the next morning. She looked at the logs, saw nothing, and told him it was probably a stray asteroid or a sensor echo from the gas giant's radiation belt. She was not worried. Brogan nodded and left her office without arguing. But that night, he cleaned his rifle for the first time in weeks. He checked his ammunition count. He pulled up the station's emergency defense protocols and read through them again, slowly and carefully. He could not explain it. Not with logic, not with data. It was just a feeling, deep and cold, sitting in his chest like a stone. Out beyond the edge of the system, hidden in the black emptiness between the stars, 3 Vraxith cruisers drifted in perfect silence. Their engines were cold. Their hulls were dark. They moved like shadows through the void, patient and steady, drawing closer with every passing hour. And inside Outpost Redcliffe, everyone slept.